Okay, guys, so these are just a few little bits and pieces about, well, it's basically about how proper writers would write in Latin. So we've kind of met most of the grammar now, and this video is basically just about how people like Livy, Tacitus, Sallust, Cicero, Caesar, all the writers that you're going to read in preparation for your prose translation, um, just the kind of tricks and sneaky little things that they would do with Latin. Some of them are very straightforward, some of them are a little bit weirder. So, I mean, the first one is the historic present. So, your title is Conventions of Extended Narrative. So, extended narrative is basically how these Roman writers wrote, because none of them, well, maybe Tacitus, none of them are very good at keeping things short, let's say. So, yeah. The first thing then is the historic present. We know what this is already, though. We met it at GCSE. Basic rules are translate it into the past, unless you think it's not a historic present, it's just a present tense. So obviously, if someone's speaking, it's quite likely that the present tense should be present tense. And the main thing as well is be consistent. So soon we'll start translating poetry, and quite often poems are in the historic present. You can translate them in the present tense if you like, to keep that kind of vividness in your English. And that's fine as long as you keep everything in the present tense. You have to be consistent. So if you decided that the present is historic, you have to keep everything in the past. If you decide that you're going to keep the present in order to be more vivid, like the original writer will be reading Ovid's poetry, so like Ovid would do, then that's fine, but you have to keep everything in the present. So the main thing with the tenses is consistency. Okay, the next thing to note is the historic infinitive, which is exactly the same as the historic present, except instead of a full present tense verb, you have an infinitive. So we've got an example here: cedere, insequi, observare, and then resistere, propulsare. So you've got a series of infinitives, and these are often used to kind of pick up the pace, to make things more dramatic. It creates more of a sense of a list of things going on. So obviously, a lot of what you read will be scenes of war. So making the pace quicker and more dramatic will be a common feature. So historic infinitives will often be used. So this one, we would translate it as a part yielded, others pursued, they held to neither the standards nor their ranks, and when danger had captured any of them, there they resisted and they fought. Okay, so you can see there, I've translated this one as yielded, this one as pursued, this one as held to, you could translate it as observed if you like, this one as resisted, and this one as fought. So I've translated them all as if they are just perfect tense active verbs. Okay. Obviously, you've got to watch out for this, because sometimes infinitives will just be infinitives. The first clue that you have to translate them like this is that there will be a list, because it's picking up the speed. And obviously, you then also need to look out for, is this part of a construction? So could it be that it's an infinitive because it's in an indirect statement, or could it be that it's infinitive because it follows wallow or possum or something like that? So consider all the options, but this is just adding an additional option to the translation of an infinitive. There's another example here. This example, again from the textbook, shows how actually you could end up translating these infinitives as nouns rather than verbs. They might make a bit more sense in that way. So you can see here we've got sequi, fugere, occidi, and capi. So we've got two active infinitives, sequi and fugere, and then two passive infinitives, occidi and capi. And then your kind of introductory sentences. So then a horrible scene in the open plains. And then it literally says to follow, to flee, to be killed, to be captured, that doesn't make any sense. So this is the kind of nice moment in Latin where we just have to take it into our own hands and think about what it actually means. So instead of translating them as infinitives, describe what's going on. So pursuit, flight, people being killed, people being captured. Okay, would be a nicer translation for that one. So consider the fact that it could be translated as a noun rather than infinitive. Okay, the next little thing is extended indirect speech. Now, we have seen kind of shorter examples of this at GCSE, but it can become a little bit ridiculous in prose translations at A-level, and it's very common, and also it's very easy not to spot and to get confused as to why there seem to be a load of subjunctives or there seem to be a load of infinitives, and to forget that actually the whole thing started with a verb of saying or stating or believing, etc. So the rules essentially here are, when you have reported speech in Latin, there is usually just one introductory verb. So we know when we first learned the indirect statement that there's a verb of speaking at the start of the indirect statement. And even if that person continues to say a million other things, you would not repeat the original verb of speaking. In English, you'd be more likely to. So you might say, the man entered the room and said that the slaves were here. He also told us that the table was clean, or whatever. So you can see there you've got, he said that and he also told us that. In Latin, you don't do that. You don't repeat the verb. You just have one at the start and then you have to deal with everything else that follows. So in this example here, we've got postulavit, demanded. So this Ariovistus guy demanded that Caesar should not bring any infantry to the meeting. Okay, that's your first thing. You've got an indirect command there. It's a negative indirect command with ne, and you've got an imperfect subjunctive. Okay, but then you've got vereri, which is an infinitive. And the reason for this is the Latin has now taken the original verb, postulavit, and it's already put in an indirect command, but now it's following it with an indirect statement with an infinitive, vereri. So in English, we're going to have to put in something like, he said that. Or you could, if it makes sense, put in, and that, blah, 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 with your indirect statement. So we've got Ariovistus demanded, etc. And he said that, vereri, he was afraid that. And then you have your fearing clause. So he was afraid that he would be surrounded by him through a trick. Okay. So you've got your infinitive, vereri. Then he's afraid that he, se, would be surrounded, your fearing clause, by him, etc. That should be ab eo, not ad eo. Through a trick, per insidias. Okay. So you have, therefore, your original verb postulavit, but we've kind of put that to one side now. So we can just put in the word, and he said that. The point is that this Ariovistus guy is continuing to speak, so we don't need another verb. Okay. So we've had an indirect command. We've then had an indirect statement, but that was followed by a fearing clause. And then, after the semicolon with uterque, okay, we have another clause. And this one is another indirect command. So we put in another and that, uterque, each, veneret, should come with their cavalry. Okay. So we've had an indirect command, an indirect statement, an indirect command, and then to finish off with, we spot another infinitive, so we must have another indirect statement. So, and he said that, non esse venturum, se non esse venturum, he would not come, alia ratione, with any other reason, for any other reason. Okay. So each time here, you've got your indirect command starting here, you've got your indirect statement starting here, another indirect command starting here, and another indirect statement starting here. And you've noted that with each one, I've said something like, and he said that, or and that such and such would happen. Okay, this is again where we can be nice and a little bit loose with our translation, but the point is that we are figuring out exactly what this Latin means and then transferring that into nice English. So we're not constricted to translating the Latin literally, because then it would make absolutely no sense.